Alright, y'all, so today I want to do a very quick review of the final film in the Hobbit trilogy, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, the third film and the final film. This was released in 2014 and directed by Peter Jackson. So, going into the final film of the Hobbit trilogy, to kind of give you my initial thoughts on it before I go deeper into it, my overall opinions is it's an okay movie. It's not good. It's not horrible. It's just kind of mid. It's meh. The main feeling I was getting from this movie for the most part, it felt very empty for the most part watching it. Now, there are some really good moments in it and really good scenes and some fantastic moments, I be at that. But overall, I think it really feels like this is the movie where I think out of all the other Hobbit movies, it really feels like they're stretching for time. They're trying to pad this thing out and stretch this thing out to the longest it can, which is ironic because this movie is also the shortest of the Hobbit trilogy, coming in at about 2.5 hours, which, by the way, I've been watching all the theatrical versions of these movies, including this movie. So that's kind of my general opinions on it. Now I'm going to get into my pros, my cons, and my overall thoughts on this story. Because I think, one of the things I said before was it feels kind of empty. And I think partly is due to the fact that this is only just part of of one book, right? They're adapting one book over 3 movies. They're really stretching out the material. And I think it really feels it here in the third movie because, this is just the ending of the book. It's just drastically extended. The battle's pretty huge. And it just, like I said before, it doesn't feel like really, in a weird way, like a real movie. It feels like like another episode to a series or something. But instead, it's released as a budgeted, movie. That being said, starting out with my pros, I really like the acting from all the actors involved. And I think the CGI is still really hit and miss in this movie. There are parts of the movie, especially the battle itself, the Battle of the Five Armies. How was that? I feel like parts of it were really good. There's some fantastic moments in the battle. I like when the dwarves show up and they attack the orcs. That's a really great part of the battle when the orcs first arrive and stuff. I even like when the falcons show up at the very end, just like in the book. That was a really nice touch. The Battle of the Five Armies, you got orcs, humans, elves, dwarves, and nature, I guess, or eagles. And I thought that, like I said before, that was a pretty cool part of the battle. It's kind of brief. It happens at the very end. It's pretty cool. I also like a lot of the destruction. It's not just also on the giant field. They kind of go into like a sort of like a town, abandoned town that was near Eredor, the dwarf mountain, the Misty Mountain, so to speak. There's a lot of battling there. There was some really cool scenes of the sort of urban combat, which I don't know if I can't exactly remember because I haven't seen the Lord of the Rings in a while, but I don't remember if that was actually in Lord of the Rings. Like, was there a lot of scenes of urban combat? And there's some really interesting parts. Now, there's a lot of goofy parts with the humans and the orcs, but there's also a lot of really good action. I also thought, too, the battle scenes at the end with Azog and Thorin were pretty cool. I also thought, even admittedly, some of the Legolas battle scenes are pretty cool, even though I do feel like the fights are really drawn out. And some of the physics are just ridiculous in this movie. And I'll get into some of my negatives here, but there's some really goofy moments in this movie, more so than the other movies. Like, I can appreciate the level of camp to a certain degree, but then when it gets like video game levels, kind of ridiculous, that's where I kind of really started laughing and tuning out. And obviously, of course, I'm going to mention that infamous scene in this movie involving Legolas. But yeah, there's some really good moments. I think the best moment for me is when Thorin decides that he's going to be the king basically be the king that he's supposed to always be and lead his pack into the battle and join the fight and get over his greedy, selfish ways. It's one of the best moments, period, in a War of the Rings, Tolkien-inspired Peter Jackson movie. I really jumped out of my seat and, just shouted. It was a really great part of the movie. It was really paid off. And I thought, too, the storyline of him being greedy and controlled by the mountain and stuff was pretty well illustrated and well shot. And seeing the sort of redemption arc, just like at the end of the book, of course, and the whole theme of greed was really good. And this is, of course, kind of emphasized when Thorin dies and tells Bilbo to value friends over greed. Like I said, it's a children's book. The Hobbit is a children's book, but still, I felt that was a pretty strong and powerful scene. So yeah, some of the action's really good. Some of the CGI is hit and miss. Some of it's really well done. Some of it gets a bit too much. Some of it looks a little uncanny, but nothing I would say that is drastically horrible to a certain degree. There are some pretty infamous scenes. Yeah, there's not really too much else to be said about this movie just because it is, like I said, only part of one book. There are some minor differences that I don't remember that were in the original book. For example, when the orcs show up, Gandalf gives a reason for why they're showing up, which is basically mentioned that Sauron, who is secretly, basically commanding these armies from the shadows, so to speak, wants to take the Misty Mountain because it's like a stronghold, and he also obviously wants to use the gold. It's a very brief scene, but I think it also is really nice in world development and gives further reasons for why things are happening. Because I can't exactly remember why the orcs wanted to go to the mountain beyond just the gold there. So that was pretty cool. And I also like the completion of the subplot involving Gandalf and Sauron. There's a really cool, fight scene between Galadriel and Saruman and Gandalf and the other elf guy. I'm forgetting his name. But they all fight him. We also got a confirmation that Sauron is coming, something's happening. But they also kind of push back the threat, so to speak, from the world. Even though it's kind of very much clearly hinted that the threat's not really destroyed, it's more like pushed back. But of course, Saruman's like, oh, he doesn't have the ring, so it doesn't matter. But it's a pretty decent scene, and I like the completion of that subplot. And yeah, beyond that, there's some good action sequences here and there. Like I mentioned, I did like the theme of gold and greed here. And I also almost forgot to mention the Smaug scene. Smaug attacking Lake Town, which is the opening of this movie. I thought that was really well done. I like the scene. He's absolutely ravaging the town. And I like how he gets killed by Bard, the Arrowsman, with the black arrow. Just a really good scene. I thought it was really well executed. I thought the 70s animated film did it really well too. But this one also does it really well. So I think that was really cool. And it's just in general really well shot. Now I'm going to get into some of my cons. Like I mentioned previously, this movie just feels really empty. There's just so much battle scenes and conflicts. And I get it. It is 5 armies. It's one of the biggest battles on Middle-earth. And they really, like I said, show the scale of it. But I don't know. Just like I said before, I don't really feel the weight of it, really. I don't think the movie has earned the excitement and the payoff of the battle, because it just feels like there's just so much action happening on screen, so much CGI. It just gets to a point and becomes a little bit hard to watch, at least for me personally. And I may sound like a boomer when I'm saying this, oh, there's too much CGI, but it gets a little bit, too much. And I think that's one of the reasons why is this movie is 50% action. There's not really too much of a story here because, like I said, it is just a part of the book. So that I don't think helps this movie, and you really feel like the padding of this movie, I think specifically more just because there's really not as much a story here. I mentioned earlier too, there's some just video gamey moments that are just frankly ridiculous. For example, there's the infamous scene with Legolas where he's fighting the orc commander, can't remember his name, and it's a really long and extended fight scene. And I'm going to be frank here, it could have been chopped down. Half of it could have been chopped off because it's unnecessary. We don't need to see a long, drawn-out battle for an orc that, and let's be honest here, didn't have really that much to do with the story of The Hobbit. But it's a crazy fight scene. I will give it for creativity. They're fighting on this collapsing tower that's sort of been wedged between two sides of a mountain, and it's pretty cool. I do have to question the structural stability of such a structure. Wouldn't that thing just collapse entirely? But it's a pretty cool battle. Legolas is kicking their butts. But then of course there's the infamous scene where part of the tower collapses and he climbs on the bricks as they're falling, and it looks so ridiculous. It made me laugh when I watched it. It's such a stupid scene. I just have to question. I'm man, this is really getting a bit ridiculous here. I also want to mention too, There's even more scenes with Legolas, not just that infamous scene. There's a scene where like he jumps on top of like a really big orc troll thing, and stabs his like sword in it, and then like moves the sword so the he basically is controlling the troll. And I'm just like, bro, this is a bit ridiculous. I'm sorry. Like, this is a video game kind of thing. Like, and there's a lot of things too, like the humans too. Like, there's some characters like Bard kills a big freaking troll that's running around, or massive orc in the town, and just does it in the most stupidest way with a bandwagon. It's just really over the top, some of these sequences. And like I said, I can appreciate a level of camp here and there, but when you have scenes of dudes climbing on falling bricks and controlling orcs with a sword, it gets a bit too much. Like I said, it really makes this thing really feel like overly, entirely, like I said, the grounded world doesn't feel as grounded anymore. So that's a little bit of a con. And I think in general, the battle is just too drawn out, you know? It feels like they were like, oh, we got to make this 2.5 hour run time. Let's just extend this shit as much as we can. And it just didn't need to be that. I'm going to be honest with you, this movie could have been just 1.5 hours. Like, I don't think it needed to be this long. They could have chopped an hour off. So, yeah, I just personally think the battle goes on for a bit too long, and there's not much of a story, which I think is a little bit of a conundrum with this movie, because it's just, like I said, it is just adapting the third act of the book. So, you know, it's a bit weird. And maybe the writers could have injected something more into the narrative. I don't know. There's also the whole elf subplot with Ethereal and Killy dying. Now, I didn't expect Killy to die. That was a bit surprising. I thought they were actually genuinely going to make it. And, I mean, you know, it was a sad... I will admit myself, that was a little bit of a sad way for it to end. Even though I really could care less about an elf and dwarf romance that was completely unnecessary to The Hobbit. But, you know, it was a little bit, at least in my opinion, a little bit of a touching scene. The Thorin scene was really good with Bilbo, but that was in the book. Of course, you got the infamous scene, too, with Ethereal, and she's talking to her, like, can't remember, but the king of the elves at that time, and she's like, I don't know, fake crying, and then he's like, what's he saying? And they're talking about love, and then he's like, oh, it's because it's real. Yeah, that's a really bad scene. Like, and I think that's partly just due to the fact that, like, the actress doesn't do a good job. Like, she just really is not doing great in this role. And just, I think in general, her character is just kind of pointless in this whole movie. You know, I don't know. I just feel like they're just running from one spot to another. And, like, you know, they're only there to warn that the orcs are coming. But, I mean, Gandalf's already doing that. So it's like, once again, I feel like they're just pointlessly added into this battle for no real reason. So yeah, overall, to wrap my thoughts off of The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies, I will say, is also wanted to quickly mention, though, before I give you my overall thoughts, I did like the ending, because it perfectly ties into Lord of the Rings. That was really cool. I did like how the ending was done. But yeah, to wrap up my overall thoughts, it's a pretty disappointing, not a great ending to the Hobbit trilogy. It just feels very empty and hollow. Not the worst thing I've ever seen. There are a lot of really good moments, a lot of really touching moments, actually some of the best moments in the entire franchise. But I think the overall experience just feels kind of empty. And I'm not sure that's, like I said before, a situation where it's just adapting a part of the book, so naturally it feels empty and not, like I said, doesn't have much space to work with, or is it just because the writers didn't add enough to the material to make it interesting for a movie worth of content? Not exactly sure, but, you know, overall, it's still an okay movie, a very, very meh ending to the Hobbit trilogy, which, of course, to a lot of people is very despised. But yeah, my thoughts on The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies. All right, peace, y'all.